Good morning, everybody. As promised, today we're going to be taking a look at biochemical macromolecules. And these are the large molecules that make up the bulk of the mass of most living organisms, of all living organisms. Um, you're going to see different names for this. It's not always called biochemical macromolecules. Sometimes it's biochemical compounds or biomolecules. It all means the same thing. And essentially, what we're talking about here are relatively large molecules that only exist in living organisms. These are things that don't happen, they don't occur in nature outside of living things. These are the unique parts of living organisms. And there are uncountable number of different molecules, and we could separate them in a whole variety of ways. But it turns out that there's four major groups that we could look at, and so today we're going to look at those four groups, and we'll talk a little bit about the structure of those groups, and go into a little bit of detail about what the different groups, the role that they play in living organisms, their functions, and then you will be doing some research into these biochemical macromolecules to sort of augment what we talk about today um, in this presentation. And as always, your goal is going to be to write down the things that I underline, with the understanding that this presentation is posted on Canvas. So if you would like to write down more but you don't have time, you can always go back and write things down later. So we'll start with carbohydrates, and carbohydrates generally exist as a polymer. And we talked about polymers the other day in class. Those are the kinds of molecules that are made up of repeating segments of the same small piece over and over and over again. Not all carbohydrates are polymers. Some carbohydrates are just the smallest piece. There are what are called simple sugars that are made up of one tiny piece of carbohydrate, the smallest piece of carbohydrate. That smallest piece is called a monosaccharide, which we often just call a simple sugar. So the smallest piece of carbohydrate is a little chunk called a monosaccharide. These are two examples of monosaccharides down here. So this one is on the right is a glucose molecule. That's a type of sugar. On the left is a fructose molecule. That's another type of sugar. If you put these molecules together, these simple sugars together, you get a polymer, and you can put them together in really, really, really long chains. And those longer chains are called complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides. And in living organisms, it's more common for carbohydrates to exist as polymers. They're usually linked together. Those monosaccharides are usually linked together. Although glucose is an incredibly important molecule that's very common in cells. It's used for energy. It's one of the kind of the fundamental pieces um, of sugar that's used for energy in living organisms. Carbohydrates are largely made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and there's lots of oxygen. So these are, if we think about our CHOMPS acronym, these are CHO. And if you look at these diagrams, you can actually see that that they are made of what looks like carbon atoms that are hooked together with essentially water molecules stuck to them. That's why they're called carbohydrates. The carbo is for the carbon atoms. The hydrates is because it's almost as if there's a water molecule stuck onto each of the carbons. It's not really water. Chemically, it's not H2O. But in terms of the ratio of hydrogens and oxygens and carbons, it does sort of work out that way. So if you look at this glucose molecule, for example, remember each of these intersections, there's a carbon atom. So we have carbon atoms here and here and here and here. And then you can see that attached to this carbon atom is two hydrogens and one oxygen. H2O. Attached to this carbon atom, two hydrogens, one oxygen, H2O. There's another H2O here. There's another H2O here. In this molecule, those H's and the O do not take the form of liquid water. It's not an actual water molecule like physically attached to a carbon atom. It's a different thing, but it's made of the same stuff. One carbon, two hydrogen, one oxygen. So that would be a the equivalent of a water molecule stuck to a carbon atom. So that's why they're called carbohydrates. And there's lots of oxygen in these molecules, and you'll see in just a minute that that's in comparison to the other CHO compound that we have, which doesn't have a lot of oxygen. Carbohydrates, their main functions are to store chemical energy. And you know this because you've talked about sugar in your other classes and even in non-science classes like health. You know that sugar is an energy storage molecule. When you eat things that have sugar or eat things that are made up primarily of carbohydrates, that's one way of giving your body energy. And what your body does with carbohydrates is it turns all of them ultimately into glucose before they're used for energy. So when carbohydrates are used for energy, no matter how they start, they end up as glucose. And then that glucose is used to create kind of the final energy molecule, which we'll talk about in a little bit today, and we'll talk about in more detail down the road. The other thing carbohydrates are used for is structure. So carbohydrates are building materials. And sometimes we don't think about that because a lot of times we think about it in terms of our food. What do we get from our food? Carbohydrates, that's an energy thing. But our body makes carbohydrates, and a lot of the structural pieces, the things that hold our body together, provide support, are made up either completely or primarily of carbohydrates. And over here you can see some of the different kinds of carbohydrates and where they're found in our diet. So we can think about starches, which are long chains of glucose molecules hooked together. We can think about as sugars, which are usually monosaccharides or disaccharides, two simple sugars put together. And then there's fiber, and some of you probably saw that this looks misspelled, but that's because in British English sometimes the R and the E are opposite from the way that they are in American English. So we would normally spell it Fiber. And these are long chains of carbohydrates as well. These aren't digestible by many animals, including humans. But they contain lots of monosaccharides. They're long chains of monosaccharides hooked together. Right? So that's carbohydrates. The next type of biochemical macromolecule that we're going to look at are lipids. Lipids are not polymers. We can't take lipids and think about them as tiny pieces that are put together to make larger molecules. They can get very large, but they're not made of repeating chains of the exact same smaller molecule hooked together over and over again. They, like carbohydrates, are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but the difference is they don't have nearly as much oxygen. When you look at carbohydrates, there's an oxygen for every carbon atom. When you look at lipids, there's usually only a couple of oxygens. You can see here the oxygens are highlighted in red. There's only two in each of these long chains of carbon. So there's a long chain of carbon there, a long chain of carbon there, a long chain of carbon there. Each of those long chains only has two oxygens in it. So there's not a ton of oxygen. And in terms of the composition, that's the biggest difference between lipids and carbohydrates. In terms of the function and the structure, it ends up being dramatically different. These molecules don't look alike, nor do they function the same way. The functions of lipids, like carbohydrates, they can be used for energy storage, but they're used for a really different kind of energy storage. Lipids, when they're used for energy storage, are generally used for what we call long-term energy storage. This is energy that isn't going to be used right away. Lipids are a very stable form of energy storage, so living organisms can store energy in the form of lipids and then just not do anything with them for a really long time. When that energy is needed, those lipids are taken apart and reassembled to make glucose. And then that glucose is used to make a different kind of energy molecule that, again, we'll talk about in a little bit today and in much more detail down the road. So lipids can be used for energy storage. They're also a critical part of the cell membrane. Most of the cell membrane is made up of a special kind of lipid called a phospholipid. And phospholipids actually are an exception to the CHO composition because they have some phosphorus in them as well. It's a really like one of the most important parts of a phospholipid. So phospholipids are a little bit of a hybrid. They don't just have like the standard lipid components. They have lipids plus a little bit of extra. So they're kind of a mix, but we still categorize them as lipids because overall they're mostly made up of macromolecules that would be categorized as lipids. And we'll talk more about phospholipids when we talk about cells. Lipids can provide protection against things drying out, which is kind of interesting because we wouldn't normally think about like lipids. If you think about lipids as being fats or oils, that doesn't seem to make sense. But actually, one of the forms of a lipid is waxes, and animals can produce some waxy substances, but it's primarily plants that make wax as a way to prevent their leaves from drying out. So in areas where it can get real hot and dry, either for part of or all of the year, plants will secrete these waxes that coat their leaves, and it's waterproof. So waxy lipids can prevent organisms from drying out in places where it's important to conserve water. Lipids can also serve as insulation, and this is primarily in animals. And where you see this most obviously is in organisms that live in real cold climates like the Arctic. That's why you see seals and polar bears with so many thick layers of fat. We call it blubber. It's to keep them warm. So that's why polar bears can live in sub-zero temperatures and swim in the ocean, even in the Arctic winter. And then the last thing is that lipids are really important for regulating cell activities, and primarily the type of lipid that does this is called a steroid. They're signaling molecules. Most of you have heard of steroids in the context of illegal steroids that some people take as supplements to increase their muscle mass. But steroids are natural. All living organisms have steroids in them. They're used to, among other things, they're used to send signals in multicellular organisms. So there are hormones, for example, that in humans are released into the bloodstream. Some of those hormones are steroids, which are lipids, and they trigger your body to do things like grow and develop, and they're signaling molecules that are released from one part of an organism that cause the rest of the organism to react in a certain way. So those are all real important functions of lipids. The next macromolecule that we're going to look at are nucleic acids, and these, like carbohydrates, generally exist as a polymer. So we can look at a single small piece of nucleic acid, but generally nucleic acids are made up of those small pieces hooked together in a repeating pattern. The smallest piece of a nucleic acid, the monomer, is called a nucleotide. And this is a nucleotide right here. This is a depiction of a nucleotide. For right now, you don't need to know the parts of a nucleotide. I'll tell them to you so you can recognize them, but you won't need to know this until we look at nucleic acids in more detail later in the year. But there's three parts to a nucleotide. One, kind of the anchor, is actually a a sugar, a type of sugar. And that holds the other two parts together. One of those parts is a nitrogenous base. So this is a substance that has some carbons and some nitrogen along with some hydrogen, and then a phosphate group. And the phosphate group is 4 oxygen atoms and a phosphorus atom. All three of those things hooked together is the simplest nucleic acid, and we call it a nucleotide. Nucleic acids in general are made up of multiple nucleotides hooked together. And all three of these parts play a really important role in the structure of nucleic acids. But as I mentioned, we won't look at that structure in detail until we talk about nucleic acids later in the year. The structure of nucleic acids, well, you can actually see from the image of a nucleotide, it's got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus in it. And most of you already know that the main function of nucleic acids is to store and communicate genetic information. Some types of nucleic acids store genetic information. Other types are used to use that genetic information to do things in cells. So they communicate the genetic information to other parts of a cell. And you almost certainly have learned about the two main types of nucleic acid, which are DNA and RNA. DNA is the kind of nucleic acid that stores genetic information. DNA doesn't do anything except sort of serve as a repository for the information. When that information needs to be used in a cell to do stuff, and we will talk about this, but not until later in the year, then RNA is used to sort of communicate the information that is in the DNA to the other parts of a cell. And both DNA and RNA are made up of long, incredibly long chains, millions of nucleotides hooked together in long chains. There's another type of nucleic acid that I mentioned earlier. It's that little energy containing molecule that cells make from glucose. And again, we'll talk about this later in the year. We're not going to talk in detail about it right now, but it's called ATP, and it is a nucleotide that is used to store energy. So this is one that's not used. ATP is not used to store or communicate genetic information. Instead, it's a little energy powerhouse, and we'll talk about that down the road. For now, we can think about nucleic acids in terms of storing and communicating genetic information. Down the road, we will add that incredibly important function that some nucleic acids, some nucleotides, are used to store energy. All right, the last biochemical macromolecule we're going to look at are proteins. And like carbohydrates and nucleic acids, proteins exist as a polymer. So there's a repeating piece that's hooked together to form a long chain. The simplest piece of a protein, the monomer, is called an amino acid. And amino acids all have the same structure. They have this part that has a carbon on one side, carbon in the middle, and then on one side of that carbon, there's a nitrogen attached to a couple of hydrogens. On the other side of that carbon, there's another carbon attached to a couple of oxygens. And then we talked about this R group, this side chain, the other day. There's something else attached to it. And there's actually 20 different kinds of things that can be attached to the main body of an amino acid, and those 20 different things that can be attached um, are what allow for the great variety in types of proteins. So there's 20 different functional groups that can be attached to an amino acid, but all amino acids have the same top part. The elements that are in proteins are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. And sulfur is really important. We're not going to go into the details of this, but you'll look at this in chemistry. Sulfur can form little bonds, kind of like hydrogen bonds. They're called sulfur bonds. And that accounts for one of the really important properties of proteins, which is that they end up kind of bending and folding and creating shapes. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. When two amino acids are hooked together, what happens is that the side of one amino acid that has the carbon and the oxygens actually gets hooked to the side of another amino acid that has the nitrogen and some hydrogens. And when that happens, it forms a chemical bond between the two amino acids called a peptide bond. And you don't need to know the details of how this happens, but you will need to know that when you hook two amino acids together, the resulting bond between them is called a peptide bond. Sometimes amino acids are called peptides, so that's why it's called a peptide bond. If you hook two peptides together, the bond that hooks them together is called a peptide bond. If you make a long chain of amino acids, it's going to have a whole bunch of peptide bonds in it. And one of the properties of proteins is that when you hook these amino acids together in long chains like this, they don't stay in a straight line. So you might think of a protein as being a real long chain of amino acids, but it doesn't just end up looking like a spaghetti noodle, really long spaghetti noodle. Instead, what happens is, as in part as a result of these sulfur bonds that I mentioned earlier, the amino acids kind of twist and fold. They make shapes, and so they don't stay in a straight line. They make these coils called helixes, or sometimes they make these folds that are called pleated sheets. And then that gets bent and folded and wrapped around again. So even these coils and the sheets that I mentioned get wrapped again into these crazy twisty shapes of, you can barely follow them, like tying a knot in a string or something. And not only that, but then multiple strings get hooked together. So we have chunks of protein here and chunks of protein here and another chunk of protein here, and all of those might get hooked together to make a final functioning protein in a living organism. So there's lots of complexity to the way that these proteins are put together, and that ends up being really important because proteins are, in many ways, the most important biochemical molecule. They are the macromolecules that do stuff in your cells. Without proteins, nothing would happen. Okay, so we'll talk about the function of proteins, and they do a lot of things that that many of you have thought about in the past, which is that they're often thought of as sort of structural proteins or macromolecules. So the functions of proteins, one of the main functions is structural. Hair, for example, is made of protein. Connective tissue is made of protein. Your muscles have a lot of protein in them. The substances that hold your cells together, like your skin, is largely made up of proteins and carbohydrates. We think about proteins as being structural because we think about that when we eat stuff. We think about, well, if you want to, build muscle, for example, if you're an athlete, then you want to make sure that you eat foods that are high in protein, because that protein it ends up being used to build tissues. But proteins also do stuff, and in living organisms, often it's the stuff that they do that makes them most important. One of the things that proteins do is they can move things around. And that's really important, especially in multicellular organisms. We have to get stuff from one cell to another cell. Oxygen is a great example of that. When we breathe oxygen in humans, oxygen is brought to our lungs, but then it needs to be distributed to the rest of the cells in our body. That happens in our blood, and it is a protein called hemoglobin that carries oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our bodies. The most important internal function of proteins is as something called an enzyme. And on the surface, it doesn't sound like enzymes would be all that important. What enzymes do is they speed up chemical reactions. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the next couple of weeks. And so you might think, well, okay, so it speeds things up. How important is that? Well, it turns out that it's critically important because in general, the things that enzymes speed up would happen so slowly that they would essentially be useless. So, for example, if your body needed to get energy from, say, a sugar like glucose, that could happen without enzymes, but it would happen so slowly that there's no way it could support life. Enzymes speed things up by hundreds or thousands or millions of times. Essentially, we can think about enzymes as actually doing things. It's like they make things happen. They don't really, because really what they do is they speed things up. But it's kind of like thinking about, going to Japan from Corvallis. Could you do it without an airplane? Yeah, you could. You could walk to the Pacific Ocean, and then you could chop down a tree, and you could carve a canoe, and then you could like hunt a bunch of stuff and gather water, and then you could paddle across the Pacific Ocean and get to Japan. But really, you probably wouldn't make it, and you probably wouldn't even try. That's kind of how enzymes are. Enzymes are like the jet plane that gets people to Japan. It's what makes that kind of travel possible. Enzymes are what make virtually all of the internal functions of cells possible. One last really critical function of proteins is defense. Antibodies, which most of you have heard of, they're a real key part of our immune system, are used to fight off infectious diseases. They can fight off bacteria and they can fight off viruses as well. So the four main functions of proteins are for structure, transport, defense, and then these enzymes, which again we'll talk about those later. And as I mentioned, it's kind of weird because enzymes, it seems like, well, it's just speeding things up a little bit. How is that so important? Well, it's because it speeds things up so much that effectively we can think of those things as if they wouldn't happen at all without the enzymes. So it's enzymes like do stuff inside cells. So that's a quick overview of these biochemical macromolecules. The next step is going to be for you to do some research in small groups and document your research in posters. So there's a assignment on Canvas that explains what you're going to do, and there's a template available for you to use as well. And I will be back next week, so take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all then.